I just took apart an RX-8 engine recently. Rest of the parts I'm still cleaning right now, but this is the front iron, and I have made a big discovery about Renesis engines. I can tell you, or at least show you the potential of what these engines have in the future. And I've said this for a long time. I've always said that the casting, the iron itself, is one of the biggest problems with this engine because the exhaust is in the same area. And cast iron doesn't really dissipate heat as well as aluminum would. So, and looking now at an actual housing itself for an iron, 13B Renesis iron, I've noticed a couple of things that can be changed out with these irons that can be a lot better about them. And you can make them perform better, be more efficient, last longer under boost or some sort of circumstance, right? So take a look at the exhaust, because that is the hotly debated topic. First time is my first Renesis I ever took apart. So I've noticed that, like on the 13B housings, you have the EGR hole, but it is a lot smaller. Goes through here, and there's a little opening in the port for the secondary air injection for emissions. Obviously, fresh oxygen goes through here. Then it gets ignited in the port, and then boom, it's a lot cleaner on startups where it's cold outside. So it's really good for the catalytic converter readings. It's actually not good for the catalytic converter at all. It actually kills it over time and causes a lot of back pressure. Anyways, that's one design flaw that people can't really fix like they do on the ARC-7 housings, because you can also just plug these, but you can also plug the hole that exists here, and then you can get rid of that nasty lip on the exhaust port that causes some sort of turbulence, right? So you still have tiny amounts of turbulence, but you already covered the hole here, at least because there's two of them, not the ones on the outside, but the one here. If people are experienced, they either put a plug or something like that, you know. And then people can also just remove the sleeve entirely, the Inconel sleeve, and get rid of the nasty lip, plug it up here, and you have a little turbulence, but you have maximum flow. And the aluminum housing will take it for some time, but it'll at least still dissipate the heat better than it would on cast iron, which is why nobody removes the Inconel exhaust sleeves on the Renesis. Because if you do, you warp the iron a lot quicker than you would warp a housing. You know, at least this has a function that if you remove this, it's perfectly for racing, naturally aspirated racing, turbocharged, boosted racing. And because now you no longer have this, there's no turbulence there at all, right? So you completely designed that out of the iron. Not only that, but it makes it, I would say, not much of a difference, but it will make it structurally stronger. But because it's already billet steel aluminum, it's already a lot stronger anyways, right? Now you don't have the Inconel sleeve, which means that this whole port, without even changing the size of this iron at 40 millimeters, gets a lot bigger, right? And then you don't have that nasty lip on the inside either. Another thing you can do is that you can change where the port is located, and you can probably make it even bigger without having to have overlap. And that's actually one of the main rules about these engines, is that you can do a lot to these engines, but the one thing you can never introduce is overlap. Overlap is the killer of all Renesis engines. These exhausts, even though with the idea of making it out of billet steel, removing, you don't need the Inconel sleeve, you don't have the secondary air injection hole, no matter what you do, it will never outflow a peripheral port at its best, right? So you have to work within the limits of the no overlap, right? And the limits are not as restricted as people think they are. It's just a kind of high barrier to cost, right? So essentially, you have to work within the no overlap, and you can weaponize that pretty well, right? Because with overlap, these exhausts, even at their best, like I said, they cannot scavenge as well to actually make usable horsepower in the top end as a peripheral port does. At least a peripheral port, the exhaust is such free flowing and straight shot that it's able to scavenge enough exhaust gases at higher PM to actually be usable for overlap, right? So with this one, You cannot still have overlap. No bridge ports, no peripheral ports on the intake or semi-peripheral ports. And obviously, if you're the type of person that thinks a hybrid exhaust is a good idea, I personally disagree. I think staying with the side exhaust ports on a Renesis is the whole goal of it, but you can improve that. You don't need to add peripheral exhaust ports. I feel like that just kills all flow at all RPM, essentially. So, no sleeve, no secondary injection hole, and because you can change the shape, you can also move where the water jackets interact within the plate as well, especially near the exhaust area. So you can move it somewhere else, and then you can essentially make this port larger. Not only because now that you don't have the sleeve anymore and this nasty lip and this turbulence hole from the secondary air injection, you can make a smoother bend. It doesn't have to be strictly 90 degrees. Now I can tell that Mazda did their best to make this as smooth as possible, but honestly, with all the restrictions in place, it's not going to help that much. It'll basically last for as long as you can push it for, you know, and in the drag race, they're already tearing down engines anyway of a couple passes, so to them, this doesn't matter. Right? This has some benefit. You can get a larger custom manifold for the turbo, or a custom header if you're naturally aspirated nitrous, right? So this, you remove that, you know, you can kind of get rid of the problem there. See, the only thing you can do with these, other than port them just like you would port them here, that's one similarity, but you can't really port these much larger, and you can't port them much further down because you'll cut into the water jacket. And you can't really do much to smooth it out here because the secondary air injection hole is right there in the port. So you can't really smooth it out that much because then you just open that hole more and you cause more turbulence. And then at the same time, just like the port on the older housings, you can't really get rid of the lip that exists in the Inconel sleeve, which already causes turbulence anyways. And then you also have to deal with the size of the port. It's a lot smaller, and that nasty 90-degree angle that is in the port, right? So you can't remove this sleeve to smoothen things out, because then it comes at the expense of the iron killing itself a lot quicker, right? And that's the problem. You can't take that sleeve out. And then the most that people will do for this is they'll tap it and drill it, or they'll just put a block off plate at the simplest point. So block off plate here, or drill, tap the bolt so it covers it as much as possible, and then you can only port this so much, right? But here's where a solution lies in that I saw, that I started researching on about these engines. The number one thing that has to be changed immediately is the casting, right? If you can make this irons out of billet aluminum, you're gonna solve so many hurdles with these engines. First of all, if you have billet aluminum, you don't need these Inconel sleeves anymore, because the aluminum will dissipate the heat, and because it's billet steel aluminum, you don't need a sleeve at all, because the housing will dissipate the heat and it'll hold the heat well. You know, any kind of temperature spikes doesn't kill it immediately, right? That is the best part about it. So you don't need this Inconel sleeve. So basically, because this is the front iron, it's about 40 millimeters wide, right? You can make a billet plate with pretty much everything very similar in the sense of the RX-8 platform for the front iron. And on the machine that you make the billet plates on, you know, in the computer program, you can get rid of this secondary air injection hole. You can completely wipe that off, and then now you have a nice clean area right here. Now that you have all this stuff removed, you can really smooth out this port to be a nice ramp instead of a straight 90-degree angle, right? Like I said, it's still never going to outflow peripheral port, but at least I'm guessing between 15 to 20% flow characteristics will improve on the exhaust ports. Now this is another I'd say finding that I actually figured out today. Most of the stuff I figured out yesterday. So essentially, the goal: make a billet front and rear iron, keep it 40 millimeters, no sleeve, no secondary injection. You can move where the port is located without having to add overlap at all, right? So you can keep it zero overlap, which is also good for the street and emissions and good torque on the low end, right? But basically, that's for the front and rear. Now for the center, I'm like, how do I fix that? And the idea came up pretty easily today. Already on the regular Renesis engine, and I don't have the center iron with me, I'm still cleaning it. The center Renesis plate is 50 millimeters, so it's already 10 millimeters larger than the front and rear, right? Now here's a problem that the center iron has. Unlike on the older engines, each rotor has its own exhaust port on the older engines, right? Rotor 1 has its own full exhaust port, rotor 2 has its own full exhaust port, right? Now, on the Renesis engine, there's 3 exhaust ports, but that means that one of them has to share both. Now, being at 50 millimeters, I personally don't think that's wide enough to have useful efficiency and scavenging for the engine without having to introduce overlap. So I'd say the best course of action for the center plate is that you make a center plate for the Renesis, but instead of 40 or 50, you make it 80 millimeters. And 80 millimeters is the size of the 13B housing already to begin with. So that gives you a fair amount of exhaust flow on the center iron that it doesn't have to, and you basically increase in even more efficiency. Now, it does make the engine longer, slightly longer, which means that you do need a custom eccentric shaft. You do need a custom manifold, but you can still use the factory rotors and the factory housings, right? So it makes it at least somewhat practical that you can still reuse some parts, and obviously the front and rear stationary gears, right? And then the special thing about the center plate, because it's 80 millimeters, it's just as wide as the 13B housing. You can add a center bearing so that it doesn't get as stressed, that each shaft doesn't flex as easily, right? So overall, make this entire front and rear 40 mil billet. You improve the flow improve the flow characteristics, efficiency, the heating problem, the strength problems, all that stuff. You get out of the way. You don't even have to change the actual physical footprint of the front and rear. The one that you really have to work on is the center, and that will be a little bit more custom. But I guarantee you that if anybody ever has the money to do this, the Renesis will actually be really more renowned. Combined with my friend's proprietary technology for the sleeves and the spark plug housings, I think combining that with this kind of Renesis engine will make one of the greatest rotary engines in existence. An engine, and I would say the only downside, and this is already a downside to the Renesis to begin with, like I said, they don't benefit from overlap, so they're never going to get the notoriety of the, the idle, the aggressive brop, brop, brop noise, right? Never going to sound like that. And obviously it's still going to be quieter than a peripheral port, but you know what? You're still going to have rotary noises. It's still going to be loud anyways. It's just going to be quieter at lower RPMs and still slightly quieter at higher RPMs. But honestly, the footprint of that is that it's more sensible as an everyday car. Not only that, it's also more unassuming. Imagine this kind of engine, you put it in an RX-8 and it still is quiet and sensible, but now it has way more punch, way more torque, way more efficiency, combined with the way that the housings, have the spark plug sleeves. The full burn housings is what my friend has. I just call them spark plug sleeves because they are sleeves in some sense. But you combine all of that, you can make this engine incredible. And that just shows me that, every single rotary engine has so much left on the table for them. These engines are so unfinished, but you know what? Mazda gives the blueprints, and you can fix all these issues. It is technically possible in every single fashion. When you don't even have to reinvent the wheel. Like I said, you just make this iron out of billet, right? Keep the same size, same footprint, same port sizes on the intake. You can obviously change how your exhaust is, the actual on the face itself. But this entire thing, the whole system becomes more seamless, flows better in all of its capacity. So that is the biggest finding I found about the Renesis. The Renesis, I don't think, is as bad as people say that it is. Mazda did something. They were onto something here, and I feel like if they would have kept going, and they would have fixed the issues with the housing first, because I feel like that was the biggest issue to tackle. This engine would have probably still been here today. The RX-8 probably would have had a second generation, third generation, just like the RX-7. The legacy of this car could have been a lot different and wilder if Mazda took the right steps.